The shuttle's descent was slower than he liked, which, for someone who had spent more hours dodging plasma fire than negotiating handshakes, was almost soothing. It hummed with a mechanical purr, a sound so alien that it made him feel like a spectator rather than a participant in his own travel. Through the translucent canopy, he could see the city below, a lattice of crystalline towers and floating terraces that refracted the light of twin suns into a million impossible rainbows. He kept his hands clasped over his stomach, not because the descent was dangerous, but because the slightest jolt reminded him of every rib he'd fractured and every tendon he'd overstrained. The human body was remarkably resilient, he told himself, though it apparently had a sense of humor. Each groan and pop of cartilage was like a subtle cosmic joke. When the shuttle finally touched down, the hatch opened with a hiss that sounded almost like a sigh of relief. He stepped out onto the polished obsidian floor of the landing platform, nodding politely to the attendants who lined the ramp. They were tall, elegant, and impossibly symmetrical, their long ears curving backward with an almost musical grace. He tried not to stare, but even in his battered state, his human curiosity got the better of him. There was a whisper among the attendants, a flicker of amusement that he mistook for interest, though he suspected later it was closer to bemusement. He offered a small joke, something about how humans considered stubbed toes a near-death experience, and was rewarded with polite, slightly confused smiles. Apparently, interstellar humor did not always translate. The grand doors to the throne hall opened in a wave of light, and the human straightened his shoulders, ignoring the twinge in his hip. He had been through worse. Negotiating his gate for diplomacy seemed minor by comparison. The hall stretched impossibly high, with ceilings that glimmered like frozen starlight and walls that pulsed faintly, as if breathing in sync with the city itself. Holographic tapestries projected scenes of battles and treaties, though the battles were stylized, almost comical in their exaggerated heroics. The attendants whispered that these were ancient myths, some older than the human species itself. He nodded to himself, thinking they looked like intergalactic comic strips, and muttered under his breath that perhaps the aliens had a better sense of irony than he realized. At the far end of the hall, the throne rested on a platform of polished crystal that seemed to float above a sea of softly glowing mist. The queen sat upon it, and even from this distance, her presence was undeniable. She looked human enough that he almost forgot the ears at first, long, tapered, elegant. But the eyes told a different story. They were the color of molten silver and measured not only what you were, but what you had survived. Her attendants bowed, their movements a silent choreography of deference and caution. He noticed the flicker of amusement pass among them. Someone whispered about how humans dressed for battle, as if their injuries were fashion statements. He grinned despite himself, imagining a runway of scarred diplomats. "Approach, human," a voice resonated through the hall. It was smooth, layered, and impossible to ignore, the kind of voice that made you reconsider every sarcastic quip you had ever made. He took a deep breath, feeling the bandages beneath his tunic rub against tender flesh, and moved forward. With each step, he imagined he could hear the faint whisper of the city through the floor, like a soft hum cheering him, or perhaps warning him. When he finally reached the platform, the queen leaned slightly forward, and the air seemed to tighten around him, as if expecting confession, accusation, or a spectacle. He offered the faintest smile, which he hoped appeared calm, and not like a man who had been beaten, burned, and thrown from more than one transport ship. The queen's gaze swept over him in a way that made him wish he had ironed his shirt. Then her eyes paused, not on the tunic, not on the limp, but on the marks that traced his body like an unread map of suffering. Bandages could hide bruises, tunics could hide cuts, but not all of it. There was a story written in scars, each line a sentence he had not spoken. For a heartbeat, the hall was silent, save for the soft hum of the crystalline floor. Then a faint, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Gravity's been particularly rude lately," he said, his voice light enough to suggest a joke. The attendants did not laugh. The queen tilted her head, one elegant ear brushing against a silver-streaked braid, and he realized humor, like bravery, was sometimes lost in translation. He tried another joke, a little quip about how humans considered bruises a form of accessorizing, and allowed himself a quiet chuckle. One of the attendants, a young woman with a slight lisp in her clicks and hums, giggled softly, which made him feel marginally victorious. The queen did not smile, but she did lean forward slightly, her expression sharpening as if she were attempting to read not only the marks upon his body, but the motives that had carried him through them. He straightened, resisting the urge to cough painfully against the bandages, and realized this was unlike any court he had visited. Here, pretense and protocol meant less than courage, endurance, and honesty, even if the last was unspoken. The attendants attempted small talk, pointing out minor galactic phenomena visible through the windows, and he responded with quips about human superstitions. When they remarked on the beauty of the twin suns, he said humans had a saying, "If it's bright, make sunglasses mandatory." There was a ripple of bemused titters, and he allowed himself a short sigh of relief. Humor, at least, had made a small bridge. But beneath it, the weight of the moment pressed in. The queen's eyes had not moved from his wounds, and he sensed something stirring in her that no polite joke could reach. She was measuring him, yes, but also something far deeper. The integrity of silence under suffering, the stubborn refusal to beg, the quiet assertion of worth through endurance. A court physician approached, hovering slightly above the floor with anti-gravity supports, and made an overly formal remark about asterisk fragility thresholds in bipeds. The human raised an eyebrow and said dryly, "You'd be surprised what humans can survive on a bad day and a full stomach." The queen's eyes flicked at him sharply, and for the first time he sensed a shift. Humor had kept the edges soft, but it had not distracted her. She understood what jokes could not mask. His body had been violated, tested, and marked, and he had walked here anyway. The thought, simple yet profound, seemed to resonate through the crystalline hall. He straightened again, making a conscious effort to project composure rather than pain. A slip, he knew, would invite pity, and pity here was dangerous. "I suppose," he muttered, "that in some societies a human wearing scars is considered a diplomatic hazard." The attendants smiled nervously. One whispered to another about human eccentricity. The queen, however, leaned forward slightly, her fingers brushing the arms of her throne in subtle emphasis, and asked in a voice that cut through the light chatter, "Who did this to you, human?" He paused, the first wordless silence since he had entered the hall. The question was not rhetorical, it demanded nothing less than truth, but he had none to give that satisfied protocol. He tilted his head, the faintest smirk tugging at his lips, and said, "Oh, some bad employers, worse chairs, and one very uncooperative shuttle." The words were absurd, but the effect was electric. A ripple of tension softened as attendants exchanged quiet, bemused glances. The queen's lips twitched, perhaps a hint of the smile he had dared to hope for, but her eyes remained sharp, calculating, impossibly alive. He realized then that he had stepped into a court unlike any other, a place where humor could coexist with danger, where laughter could coexist with scrutiny, and where endurance, silently worn on flesh, commanded attention greater than any sword or fleet. The air seemed to thrum softly, and though he had expected diplomacy to be a formal, stifling affair, he felt, for the first time in weeks, the faintest spark of relief. Somehow, against all odds, he had made the journey intact, scars and jokes included. And the queen, who had seen everything, was watching, waiting, and thinking. The smallest twitch of her ear betrayed more curiosity than any human could safely interpret. He straightened one last time, adjusted the folds of his tunic to hide the worst of the bruises, and realized something both terrifying and exhilarating. He had arrived as a human diplomat, but in the gaze of the alien queen, he had become something else entirely. Not a victim, not a plea, Not even a negotiator, just a human being stubbornly intact, standing in a hall that shimmered with light, history, and quiet judgment, ready for whatever came next. And somewhere beneath the polished obsidian floor, the city hummed in approval, or amusement, because even ancient civilizations appreciated a human with a sense of humor. The hall had not yet returned to normal, though the human thought it should have. Light refracted through the crystalline walls like water, splintering into prismatic patterns that danced across the faces of the attendants and nobles. He tried to focus on them, on the distant terraces where gardens floated in anti-gravity spheres, but he could not escape the weight of the queen's gaze. It was no longer mere curiosity. It was a careful, deliberate examination of the kind humans reserved for dangerous predators or exceptionally stubborn diplomats. He adjusted his posture with exaggerated care, giving his ribs a gentle nudge to remind them they still existed, and forced a faint joke from his lips. Do you suppose they charge rent for those floating gardens, or is it all covered in crown privileges? A ripple of quiet laughter spread through the attendants, lightening the edge of the tension, though the queen herself remained unamused, or so he thought. The queen's long ears flicked almost imperceptibly, a subtle sign that she was amused in a manner incomprehensible to humans. He took it as victory, small though it might be. She leaned forward slightly, the silver in her eyes reflecting the twin suns outside, and gestured for him to follow her across the hall. The platform that held her throne shimmered faintly under her weight, floating just above the soft mist that hugged the floor. He realized, with a mixture of awe and disbelief, that the throne was not merely ornamental. It responded to her presence, rising and lowering, tilting and swiveling as if the queen and her seat were a single organism. Humor bubbled in his chest. He imagined a chair with feelings, a chair with opinions, perhaps even a chair that complained when he was late to a meeting. He suppressed a laugh. The attendants gave him suspicious glances. "Walk with me," she said, her voice smooth and commanding, though carrying the faintest melodic lilt that reminded him of distant music played underwater. He followed, careful with each step. Every movement reminded him of the restraints that had once bound him and the burns that still tingled under his skin. He flexed his fingers, then shrugged lightly. "I promise I don't bite," he said, his voice carrying that absurd human humor that clung desperately to civility. One of the younger attendants, perhaps unfamiliar with human sarcasm, glanced at him with wide eyes and whispered something that sounded like a giggle concealed behind a cough. They moved through the hall, and the human allowed himself a few glances around. Holographic projections hovered near the walls, illustrating past events of the queen's reign. Wars that humans would have described as catastrophic were stylized in bright colors, showing alien soldiers executing synchronized maneuvers that seemed impossible and somewhat comical in their perfection. He quipped under his breath, "I didn't realize galactic conflicts came with choreography lessons." The queen's ears twitched at the remark, and she gave the faintest tilt of acknowledgement. Perhaps she appreciated humor after all, though she made no indication that she considered him entirely harmless. They reached a balcony that overlooked the city. The twin suns were low, casting long streaks of gold and silver across the crystalline towers. He took a deep breath, savoring the view and ignoring the residual pain in his muscles. "I've never seen a city like this," he admitted. "It's optimistic." He smiled faintly, trying to convey lightness despite the ache in his chest. The queen's gaze swept over him, and for the first time he noticed the subtle scars hidden beneath her own skin, faint patterns that caught the light in unexpected ways. She had endured her own battles, perhaps not physical but political and strategic, and her composure was built upon decades, maybe centuries of discipline. He swallowed and muttered, "We humans call it decorative pain. Clearly, you've mastered it." The queen allowed herself a small smile, almost imperceptible, that somehow carried more weight than any human expression of amusement. She gestured toward a narrow corridor leading to a chamber set apart from the main hall. He followed, keeping his steps deliberate. The corridor walls shimmered faintly, not with light, but with energy, some subtle force that seemed to hum in resonance with the city itself. He wondered idly if it was meant to calm visitors or if it measured the honesty of their intentions. He cracked a faint joke. "Do I need to confess anything before we go in, or is silence acceptable?" A faint ripple of tension eased around him. The attendants exchanged looks, a mixture of nervous curiosity and muted approval. The chamber itself was smaller, intimate, and arranged with a simplicity that belied the grandeur of the throne hall. Hollow displays projected faint star charts that shifted as if in real time, constellations unknown to human science twinkling and rearranging themselves across the walls. The queen gestured for him to sit on a chair that hovered slightly above the floor. He eased into it cautiously, every movement measured to avoid aggravating old injuries. "I must say," he said, "your furniture has better balance than most of the starship captains I've met." He chuckled softly. The queen's ears flicked again, almost like a faint nod, but she did not speak. He realized humor here was subtle, measured, like a seasoning added to a carefully prepared dish, effective only if done correctly. A physician entered, carrying a small array of medical devices that floated independently, scanning the human's bandages and bruises. "Fragile mammalian tissue," the physician intoned, eyes darting over him as if checking for hidden alarms. "Susceptible to structural compromise under moderate stress." The human raised an eyebrow. "I assure you, nothing a little diet and sarcastic commentary can't fix." He allowed himself a wink, which caused the physician to sputter, unsure whether to take him seriously or mentally file him under asterisk dangerously unpredictable. The queen finally spoke, a low murmur that carried both authority and curiosity. "Your injuries, they are not accidental. They tell a story, human. Are you accustomed to pain, or is this endurance?" He hesitated, considering a witty response about humans training for discomfort as a national sport, but settled for, "A bit of both, I suppose. We're stubborn that way." She tilted her head, long ears tracing the air behind her, and studied him. The quiet humor, the deflection, the refusal to beg, all of it seemed to intrigue her. Her eyes narrowed, measuring him not for weakness but for integrity. He allowed himself a small grin, despite the ache running through his ribs. "I imagine in some cultures," he said, "a human showing up like this would inspire pity, or at least a decent funeral." The queen's gaze sharpened, and for a moment the humor was gone, replaced by a quiet weight that made him feel both exposed and honored. He swallowed, then added lightly, "I promise I don't bite unless requested." A faint ripple of amusement passed through the chamber. The attendant stifled giggles. Even she allowed the smallest twitch at the corner of her mouth. Minutes passed with measured conversation. The queen asked questions about human politics, interstellar commerce, and navigation technologies, all of which he answered with careful honesty peppered with light jokes. He realized the humor softened the edge of scrutiny, kept the dialogue alive while deflecting pity. She was listening, observing, weighing his responses against the body before her, the endurance displayed in scars and posture. Finally she stood, the crystal floor of the chamber responding to her movement with subtle shifts in light and elevation. "Walk with me," she said, and he followed, careful to avoid missteps. The corridor stretched longer than he expected, twisting in ways that seemed impossible, yet logical once traversed. The energy in the walls hummed faintly in resonance with his own heartbeat, or so he imagined, and he cracked another joke. "I think this building just congratulated me on showing up intact." The queen's ears flicked sharply, and she allowed herself a sound almost like a chuckle, a vibration in her throat, soft, restrained. They reached a balcony overlooking a distant nebula visible through a massive viewport. Gas and dust swirled in colors no human telescope had ever recorded, and he allowed himself a moment to breathe it in. "Now this is impressive," he muttered. "All the trouble I've been through, and the galaxy decides to give me a view." She observed him quietly, and he felt the weight of her attention more keenly than any physical pain. Humor had kept the moment light, but beneath it, something ancient and potent stirred. She saw what he had endured and understood more in a heartbeat than the bureaucrats of 100 human worlds could in a lifetime. "Human," she said finally, "your endurance is remarkable. Perhaps you underestimate the power of a body that refuses to break, even when the mind is willing." He grinned faintly, though the statement sent a shiver down his spine. "I've always found humans are stubborn, mostly stupid but stubborn enough to survive." She allowed the smallest tilt of her head, acknowledging the truth in humor, the honesty in his flippancy. And in that quiet exchange, between jokes and scrutiny, laughter and observation, the human realized that the alien queen had begun to understand something fundamental. Not just that he had endured, but that endurance carried its own authority, one that no treaty, no fleet, no courtly display could match. Humor, scars, and quiet defiance, these were the measures by which he was now judged, and strangely, it seemed, they were enough. The city hummed beneath them, the twin suns spilling light across floating towers, gardens, and distant spires. Somewhere deep in the crystal lattice of the hall, the queen considered the implications. The human had arrived battered, bruised, and silent. He had joked when appropriate, smiled when allowed, and refused to beg when commanded. And in doing so, he had done what centuries of policy and diplomacy could not: made her consider humans not as expendable tools, but as something far more dangerous, resilient, unyielding, and entirely unpredictable. He straightened again, adjusting the folds of his tunic to hide the worst of the bruises, and realized that the soft hum through the corridors, the shimmer of the city beyond, and even the faint amusement in the queen's eyes were not simply aesthetic. They were the prelude to a reckoning that neither he nor the court fully understood yet. Humor had softened the moment, but endurance had hardened it. And somewhere, quietly, the balance of power had begun to shift. The chamber hummed faintly as the human followed the queen through corridors that twisted like liquid glass, corridors that seemed to remember every footstep he had ever taken. The faint resonance of energy beneath the crystalline floors pulsed in rhythm with the city above, and, he imagined, with the heartbeat of the queen herself. Humor had become his armor as much as it had been a bridge, a way to navigate scrutiny without inviting pity, a way to remind himself that he was still human, still alive, and still capable of small absurdities. He cracked one last quiet joke about how navigating alien architecture was apparently considered an extreme sport. And for the first time, he caught something that looked like amusement, if faint, in her silver eyes. They arrived in a council chamber smaller than the throne hall but no less imposing. The walls displayed a constellation map of entire sectors of the galaxy, holographic lines marking fleet positions, diplomatic treaties, and economic flows that humans had barely begun to catalog. He could see the complexity, the scale, and even in his battered state, he felt a thrill of comprehension. The queen gestured to the seat before the map, and he took it, careful to avoid the lingering aches that protested with every movement. "Do humans get diplomas for surviving interstellar politics?" he asked lightly, and she allowed herself a small twitch that might have been a smile. "The universe does not give diplomas," she said, her voice calm but layered with subtle inflections. "It gives choices and consequences." He nodded, understanding more in that instant than any lecture could have taught him. The choices he had made, to endure silently, to answer with restraint, to allow humor where needed, had carried him to this moment, standing not as a victim but as a catalyst. He had arrived battered, bruised, and underestimated, but in that state he had revealed a truth few had ever seen. Humanity's quiet resilience could reshape the intentions of empires. The attendants lingered, whispering in soft tones, and he caught fragments. "He jokes even now. He does not plead. The scars do not command sympathy, they demand respect." He allowed himself a faint grin. Even here, humor had performed its role, human absurdity softening alien judgment, allowing recognition to bloom without alarm. The Queen moved closer to the holographic map, her long ears flicking as she adjusted fleet positions and diplomatic markers. Her movements were deliberate, precise, and yet somehow graceful, like a musician conducting a symphony of power across stars. "I have learned much observing you, human," she said, gesturing toward the scars that mapped his journey on his body. "Not merely about endurance, but about perspective, about the strength in silence, about the audacity of humor where none is expected. The galaxy has often considered humans expendable, but I see now that expendable is a dangerous misjudgment." He tilted his head, allowing himself a small, ironic smile. "I'm sure some humans will take offense at being called dangerous," he said, "but I assure you it's mostly true." The Queen allowed a brief pause, studying him with a precision that made him acutely aware of every scar, every twitch, every mark of survival. "You will not speak of those who harmed you?" she asked. Her voice was soft but unyielding. He shook his head, smiling faintly. "No, some debts do not need witnesses. Some wrongs are their own testimony." The Queen nodded slowly, and in that moment a decision settled within her. Justice would be served, not by vengeance, but by the authority she commanded, by the systems she could influence with the subtle pressure of power guided by moral clarity. The chamber began to shift subtly, light tracing the map of galactic sectors. Fleet positions altered, treaties reconfigured, and the attendants whispered at the speed of thought. Orders were sent, not shouted, not forced, but executed with precision. Entire bureaucracies of cruelty and exploitation were called into question. The human watched, bemused in spite of himself. "All this because I refused to beg," he muttered under his breath. One of the attendants who had been hovering nearby whispered, "Because you reminded her what true strength looks like." He allowed himself a short, ironic chuckle, realizing the absurdity. A battered human, quietly humorous, had shifted the strategies of a star system without raising a weapon. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time seemed flexible here, and eventually the Queen gestured for him to follow her to a balcony overlooking the city. Twin suns were setting, bathing the crystalline towers in molten gold and silver. He took a deep breath, feeling the aches of his injuries but also a strange surge of vitality. The humor he had carried, the deflection, the quiet endurance had not been a shield alone, it had been a key. He looked at the city, at the floating gardens, at the impossible architecture that defied logic, and thought of all the moments that had brought him here. The fights, the restraints, the silence, the small absurd jokes told in corridors of suffering. "You are not the first human to endure," the Queen said softly, her voice carried by the faint hum of energy in the balcony. "But you are the first I have observed who understood how to endure without surrendering your essence. Humor, defiance, honesty, all in balance. The galaxy underestimates you. That mistake will cost some dearly." He nodded, wryly acknowledging the truth. "I'm glad my mistakes have value," he said lightly, and the corners of her eyes twitched almost imperceptibly, a gesture he would later recall as the closest thing to approval he had ever received from royalty. The Queen turned her gaze back to the stars, and he noticed the subtle calculations in her expression. Systems realigned, commanders reconsidered, treaties amended, not because of brute force, not because of threats, but because a throne had recognized that a human's endurance and quiet courage could not be ignored. And somewhere in that realization, the human felt a shift within himself. He was no longer just a survivor. He was an agent, a witness, a reminder that resilience could alter the balance of power without a single weapon drawn. The attendants began to prepare for his departure, a gentle hum signaling the readiness of a shuttle that would take him back to human territory. He moved with measured care, each step a negotiation with his own injuries, and allowed himself one final quip. "Next time I'll bring souvenirs, preferably ones that don't bruise me." A faint ripple of laughter passed among the aliens nearby. The queen allowed herself a small gesture of acknowledgement, her ears flicking, the faintest smile touching her lips. Before he stepped aboard the shuttle, she spoke again. "Remember, human, silence is not weakness. Endurance is not submission. Humor can be a weapon, and scars are proof that the body remembers what the mind may forget." He bowed, more out of gratitude than protocol, and said softly, "I'll remember, and I'll try not to use humor as a weapon too often." She inclined her head, the slightest shimmer of approval glinting in her silver eyes. As the shuttle lifted, he watched the crystalline city recede, the twin suns casting long beams of gold across the horizon. He felt the weight of the journey in his body, but also a lightness in his chest, a recognition of purpose that had been absent before. He had survived, yes, but he had survived in a way that mattered. Humor, scars, endurance, and silent defiance had proven to be forces more potent than fear, more enduring than pain, more influential than diplomacy alone. Somewhere in the star systems that spread like constellations on the maps he had glimpsed, the ripples of his presence would be felt. Commanders would reconsider, empires would pause, and the Queen's quiet wrath, tempered by compassion and guided by recognition of courage, would shape decisions that span light years. And the human, sitting in the shuttle with the faint ache of healing bones and the sharper thrill of understanding, realized he had changed. He was no longer merely expendable. He was a reminder, a proof, a catalyst. He allowed himself a small, ironic smile. Against all odds, he had endured, joked, and survived, not to claim power, not to seek vengeance, but to be recognized. And recognition, as he now understood, could be a far more dangerous and effective force than any fleet or weapon. Humor, endurance, and quiet defiance had done what centuries of diplomacy could not. They had awakened a throne. The shuttle ascended, leaving the city of crystal and light behind, twin suns painting streaks of molten gold across the hull. He closed his eyes briefly and thought of the scars mapped across his body. They no longer felt like wounds alone, but like medals, each one a reminder of resilience, courage, and the subtle absurdities that had carried him through. Somewhere deep within, a small chuckle escaped him, soft but genuine, and the universe, vast, indifferent, and full of possibilities, seemed for once to notice. And in that quiet moment the human knew. The galaxy had shifted because he had survived, and he would never be the same again. Every scar, every joke, every silent endurance had led him here, to the recognition that being human, fiercely, stubbornly human, was enough to change stars.